The first time I heard the drums, I mistook them for my own heartbeat. Sergeant Brune Hesk had served the Emperor for 23 years. 23 years of mud and blood, of bellowing orders over the roar of artillery, of watching good men die for a few paces of worthless ground. His left shoulder still carried the ragged scars where an orc chopper had almost taken his arm on Gorgo Prime. His right temple bore the puckered mark where shrapnel from a heretic's grenade had kissed him on the killing fields of Mordia Secundus. Those were the wounds anyone could see. The others, the ones carved into his thoughts by decades of endless war, lay much deeper than any blade could ever cut. The drums started on Carthax Seco, in the third month of what the Strategos optimistically called Operation Righteous Cleansing. The name was a lie. There was nothing righteous about what we were doing there. Carthax II had been a paradise once. An agri-world of golden wheat under twin suns, children running through fields that stretched to the horizon. Then the heretics came. They poisoned the wells, burned the granaries, raised blasphemous temples to their dark gods. Paradise rotted into purgatory. I remember the morning it began. Dawn came in red over the trenches, turning the sky the color of fresh blood. The air tasted of cordite and rot. That familiar blend of war that had become as normal to me as my mother's cooking had been, back when I could still remember her face. The 47th Acadian Shock had held the line for 6 weeks, dug in like ticks on a corpse, waiting for the order that would throw us over the top into another grinder. I stood at the lip of the fire trench, my last pistol heavy in scarred hands. The weapon had seen almost as much war as I had, metal worn smooth by years of use, power cell housing cracked and patched more times than I could remember. Below me, the squad readied itself for another day of killing. Trooper Marcus cleaned his laser gun with the careful precision of a man who knew a dirty weapon meant a short life. Corporal Vex checked his grenade harness again and again, fingers brushing over each frag like a man counting prayer beads. Young Kane, barely 18, still soft in the face despite 6 grueling months on the line, stared out into no man's land with eyes that had already seen far too much. "Sergeant," the voice belonged to Lieutenant Cordware, a pale, fidgeting man who'd arrived 2 weeks earlier, fresh from the Scola, and still convinced war held glory. "Command wants us to probe the heretic positions. Sector 7 Alpha, grid reference." I listened to the coordinates with half an ear. Numbers on a map. Arbitrary labels for scraps of ground that would be slick with blood before nightfall. His voice faded into the familiar background noise, the distant artillery, the occasional crack of a sniper round, the wet, muffled sounds of the wounded crying for their mothers in the med bunkers. That's when I heard it. Underneath the chaos of the front, beneath Cordware's nervous briefing and the murmured prayers of the half-dying, there was another sound. A rhythm. Deep, slow, primitive, like the beating of some vast heart buried far below the earth. Thump, 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 thump. At first, I assumed it was just my pulse roaring in my ears, the way it sometimes did when the adrenaline built before a charge. But this felt different. This came from outside, from somewhere beyond the trenches, beyond the war itself. And it stirred something inside me. Something that had been asleep for 23 years of loyal service. "Sergeant Hesk, are you listening?" Cordware's tone had sharpened. Officers didn't like being ignored, least of all by non-coms who'd forgotten more about war than they would ever learn. "Yes, sir." The answer came automatically, drilled into me by a lifetime of discipline. "Sector 7 Alpha, recon in force. Assess enemy strength and disposition." "Precisely. Take your squad forward at 0900. Try not to get them all killed, Sergeant." He turned and left, boots squelching in the eternal mud at the trench floor. He'd be dead within a month. They all were, these fresh-faced officers with their promotion dreams and leather-bound copies of the Guards Manual. The war would chew them up and spit out their bones just like all the others. But the drums stayed. I rolled my shoulders, cracked my neck, tried to shake the sound from my skull. The rhythm only grew more distinct, steady, insistent, matching the rise and fall of my breath. It wasn't exactly unpleasant. If anything, it felt right, familiar, like an old marching song I'd once known and forgotten, like the feeling of stepping through the door of a home you haven't seen in years. "All right, you worthless dogs," I barked, sliding into the well-worn cadence of command. "We're going over the top in 30. Check your weapons, check your armor, check the man next to you because his life might be the only thing between you and some heretic's blade." The squad moved with a smooth efficiency that only veterans possess. Even Kane straightened, his motions quick and sure as he slapped a fresh power cell into his laser gun. These were good soldiers. Men I'd trained, marched with, bled alongside across half a dozen worlds. They deserved better than to die for a few meters of poisoned soil on a world history would barely remember. The drums grew louder as we prepared to move out. The sound seemed to vibrate along the trench walls, running through the packed earth and shattered ferrocrete of our makeshift fortress. I studied the men's faces, wondering if they could hear it too. There was nothing, just the usual resolve, fear, resignation. Perhaps it was only in my head. Perhaps 23 years of campaigning had finally cracked something important behind my eyes. At 0900 on the dot, we climbed out of the trench. No man's land on Carthax II stretched ahead like a vision of the hell promised to the faithless. Shell craters full of stagnant water mirrored the blood-red sky. Razor wire coils glittered with morning dew that might as well have been tears. The corpses of previous assaults lay strewn across the churned mud. Some in guard uniforms, others in crude armor daubed with blasphemous signs. The dead did not care who had served or betrayed the Emperor. In death, they were all just meat under alien suns. We advanced in standard formation, Vex on point, Marcus and Kane watching the flanks, me at the rear with the Vox humming softly against my back. Progress was slow. Every step was a struggle against sucking mud and twisted metal. Somewhere up ahead, the heretics huddled in their own trenches, just as cold, just as miserable, just as ready to die for their beliefs. The drums beat on, relentless, and I realized I'd fallen into their rhythm as step, step, step. My boots squelched in perfect time with the phantom percussion. Somehow, it gave me strength. My gear felt lighter. The last pistol in my hand felt less like issued hardware and more like an extension of my own arm. "Contact front," Vex whispered over the micro bead. 200 meters, fortified position, looks like a listening post. I crawled forward through the muck until I could see it for myself. A rough ring of sandbags and shattered ferrocrete encircled what had once been a civilian home. The windows were sealed with bolted metal, gun ports cut where needed. Lean smoke curled from a makeshift chimney, carrying the unmistakable smell of cooking meat. My stomach tightened despite the circumstances. "How many?" I asked. "Hard to say, Sergeant. I count at least 4, maybe 6. Light weapons. Nothing we can't handle. By the book, we should have called in artillery and let the Emperor's wrath fall from above, leaving only a crater and charred bodies. But shells were scarce on Carthax II, and Command had decreed that every round needed to matter. So we'd have to take it the hard way, with lass fire, steel, and the kind of close-quarters butchery that marks the line between soldier and civilian. The drums hammered harder as I studied the enemy position. My pulse quickened. There was a stirring in my chest, something that felt old and unfamiliar, like a beast waking from hibernation. I told myself it was just anticipation, the sharpened focus of a veteran about to enter the fight. Nothing more. "Marcus, Kane, you two lay down covering fire from that shell crater on the left," I ordered, pointing toward a depression that gave a clean line of sight to the post. "Vex, you're with me. We swing wide right, hit their flank before they know we're here." "What about prisoners, Sergeant?" Kane asked. "Command still wants intel on numbers and dispositions." I looked at the boy for a long moment. I remembered being like that. Believing wars could be fought cleanly, that honor had a place on the killing fields, that even in the darkest campaigns the Emperor's light could still shine. Part of me wanted to shield what was left of that innocence. But the drums were pounding now, and with their beat came a hunger I'd never felt before. A need that had nothing to do with duty or strategy or simple survival. I wanted blood. I wanted screams. I wanted to feel bones snap under my hands and watch the knowledge bloom in enemy eyes, that their dark gods would not save them from the fury of the Imperial Guard. No prisoners, I heard myself say. Kill them all. The words surprised me. In 23 years of service, I'd always kept to the rules of engagement, always tried to conduct myself with the dignity expected of a servant of the throne. Prisoners meant intelligence. Intelligence won campaigns. Senseless killing was a stain on discipline. But as soon as the order left my mouth, it felt right. Natural. Like a key sliding at last into the lock it had been made for. We shifted into place with the silent assurance of long-blooded veterans. Every step was measured, every breath controlled, every heartbeat ticking in perfect time with the unseen drums roaring inside my skull. The sound was so loud now that I couldn't imagine how the others didn't hear it. It felt like it shook the ground beneath our feet, echoed in the clouds overhead, ran like a tremor through the bones of the world. The first heretic never knew we were there. Vex put a last bolt through his skull just as the man straightened from his post, probably stretching after a long night on watch. He toppled backward into the position, and shouts of alarm rose from within. "Now!" I roared, and we surged forward. The next minutes dissolved into a blur of motion and sound. Lasfire stitched the air, strobing the world in bursts of red light. The heretics answered with autoguns and stubbers, the air buzzing with solid shot. Someone was screaming. I couldn't tell whether it was one of ours or one of theirs. I vaulted the sandbag wall and dropped into the middle of the position. A heretic lunged at me with a combat knife, blades singing past my throat as I twisted aside. My last pistol barked twice, both rounds punching into his chest. He fell like cut grain, knife skittering away across the ferrocrete. Another figure burst from a side room, hefting a heavy stubber built to pin entire squads, not single men. At this range, if he brought it to bear, I'd be in 2 pieces. I saw his finger tighten on the trigger, saw the barrel swinging toward me. The drums crashed into a savage crescendo, and time seemed to thicken. I moved without thinking, body guided by instincts I didn't know I had. The last pistol slipped from my fingers as I lunged, closing the distance in a single bound. My hands locked around his throat, fingers digging deep into hot, vulnerable flesh. The stubber fired once, the shot going wild, and then I was crushing his windpipe with a strength that felt utterly inhuman. He clawed at my wrists, hammered at my chest with clenched fists that felt like pattering rain. It didn't matter. I was stronger, far stronger than I had any right to be. Power flowed through me like molten metal. His eyes bulged, his face darkened to a mottled purple as his airway collapsed. I could feel his pulse fluttering under my thumbs, hear the wet rattle of lungs that would never draw a full breath again. And I laughed. The sound that tore out of me was not the laugh of Sergeant Brune-Hesk, dutiful servant of the Imperium. It was darker, hungrier, drunk on pain and death. The heretic struggles weakened. My laughter only grew until it seemed to drown out even the thunder of the drums. When at last he went limp, I held him there a moment longer, savoring the heavy dead weight in my hands. Then I let him fall and turned. My squad stood watching me, expressions carefully blank, eyes not quite meeting mine. "Sector clear," Vex reported, voice level, almost too calm. 6 hostiles neutralized, no friendly casualties. "Good work," I replied, surprised at how steady I sounded. "Search for intel and supplies. We'll hold here 15 minutes, then move on." They obeyed, but I could feel their glances pricking at my back. They had seen something in those frantic seconds, something that frightened them more than the killing itself. I wanted to tell them nothing had changed, that I was still the same sergeant who'd carried them through 24 campaigns, but that would have been a lie. Something had shifted when I felt that man's life spill away under my hands. It was as if some hidden door inside me had swung open onto a room I'd never known existed. The drums were quieter now, sated for the moment, but they had not fallen silent. I knew they never would. They were part of me, woven into my heartbeat, pacing each breath. We found little of real value in the listening post. A few marked maps showing positions that had likely changed days ago. Personal trinkets that told us nothing new about enemy morale or logistics. A Vox unit, wrecked beyond repair, its circuits slagged by deliberate sabotage. What we did find were 3 Imperial citizens, civilians taken during the heretics' push through the agricultural districts. They had been tortured in ways that turned the stomach. Their flesh was carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. One had been flayed alive, another disemboweled while still breathing. The third simply beaten to death, skull caved in by repeated blows. Staring at them, I felt the drums quicken once more. But now there was something different in the rhythm, anger braided into the hunger, righteous fury demanding an answer. These heretics had tormented innocents, desecrated the Emperor's subjects for their own twisted pleasure. Death was too kind for them. They deserved agony. They deserved to feel what their victims had felt. "Throne preserve us," Cain whispered, face gone bloodless at the sight. "How could anyone do this to another human being? They're not human anymore," I said. The words came easily and carried more truth than I'd intended. The moment they turned from the Emperor's light, they became something else. Something that needs to be destroyed. We left the listening post behind and pushed on with the patrol. But the image of those ruined bodies clung to me. Every step we took, every breath we drew seemed to pull us closer to more heretics, more servants of the dark gods who thought they could foul the Emperor's realm without consequence. The drums agreed. They hammered in my skull, each beat a promise of the violence yet to come. I found myself walking faster, driving the pace until the squad had to hurry to keep formation. There were more of them out here. More enemies to find, more debts to pay in blood. I wanted to find them. I needed to. We made contact again 2 hours later at a crossroads dominated by the broken remains of an Imperial shrine. Once it had been a place of devotion. Now the heretics had befouled it, smearing sacred imagery with their obscene symbols, hanging rotting corpses from the aquila that had once crowned the structure. They had turned it into a monument to their false gods, a celebration of everything twisted in the galaxy. There were more of them this time, at least a dozen, maybe 15, armed with a mix of proper weapons and improvised brutality. They'd established a checkpoint, stopping anyone desperate or foolish enough to try to pass. From our concealment, we watched a battered ground car roll up to the shrine. I saw a family inside, a man, a woman, 2 small children. Refugees, most likely, trying to escape the fighting that had swallowed their world. The heretics dragged them from the vehicle. What followed was exactly what I expected. The family was herded into the defiled shrine, their screams echoing from the cracked walls as the heretics began their work. I'd seen it before, on other planets, in other wars. Chaos always followed the same script. Its servants gorged themselves on terror and despair like leeches on blood. "We have to help them," Cain whispered, face twisted with helpless rage as the screams went on. "It's too late," Vex said, voice flat with an old soldier's resignation. "There's too many of them and we're too far out. By the time we got there, it had already be done." He was right, of course. Tactically, it made no sense. A single squad assaulting superior numbers in a fortified position was suicide. The correct response was obvious. Observe, count guns and bodies, map their dispositions, then pull back and report to command. That was what the manual said. That was what 23 years of training and experience had drilled into me. But the drums were screaming now. Their thunder drowned out rational thought. The sound of civilian screams blended with the pounding in my skull until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Something hot and red built up behind my eyes, a pressure that demanded release. "No," I said, rising from cover. "We're going in." "Sergeant, that's suicide." Vex protested immediately. "There are too many of them. We need to fall back and call for support." I turned to look at my corporal, a man who had served at my side for 3 years, who had saved my life twice and whose life I had saved in return. His face was calm and professional, the face of a soldier who understood how wars were really fought. But behind his eyes, I saw it. Fear. Not fear of death. We had all made our peace with that long ago. Fear of me. Fear of what I was becoming. "We're going in," I repeated. This time my voice carried a weight that brooked no argument. "That's an order, Corporal." The attack that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in 2 decades of warfare. We moved like living shadows, like the Emperor's own angels of death descending on the faithless. My last pistol sang its deadly song, every shot hitting home with impossible precision. One heretic's head burst in a spray of blood and bone. Another folded over as a bolt of light punched through his chest, cooking his organs to sludge. But it wasn't the shooting that fed the hunger rising inside me. It was the close work, the intimate killing the drums demanded. When my power cell ran dry, I drew my chainsword and hurled myself into the enemy line like a man possessed. The first heretic tried to block with his autogun. The chainsword's whining teeth chewed through the barrel and kept going straight into his chest, tearing him open from collarbone to sternum. Hot blood sprayed across my face, copper on my tongue, and I realized I was grinning beneath my helmet. The second came in from the side, a crude axe raised high. I ducked under the swing and brought my blade up in a diagonal arc that opened his belly like ripe fruit. His entrails spilled steaming onto the ground, and he looked down at them with almost comical surprise before collapsing. The third dropped his weapon and begged. He was young, probably no older than Cain, with soft features that belonged to someone who'd known comfort most of his life. His gun lay forgotten at his feet, and he held his hands up in surrender, tears streaking his cheeks as he babbled for his life. "Please," he stammered, voice cracking with terror. "I don't want to die. I have a family, children. Please don't kill me." I should have taken him prisoner. The rules of engagement were clear. An enemy who laid down his arms and offered no resistance was to be captured for interrogation. It was tactically sound and morally correct. The Emperor's servants did not butcher the helpless. But the drums were at a fever pitch now, and through their pounding I heard something else. Laughter. Deep, rich, and infinitely cruel. Laughter that belonged in fighting pits and execution yards. It came from somewhere far away, from a realm of brass and blood, where warriors fought without end for the amusement of dark gods. And it came from my own throat. "Your family is already dead," I told the young heretic, raising my chainsword overhead. "Your children rot in mass graves. Your wife feeds the worms. Now it's your turn." The blade came down. His pleas turned to screams. The screams broke into silence. When it was over, when the last heretic lay twitching in his own blood, I stood in the center of the carnage and felt something I had never known in 23 years of war. Satisfaction. Not the grim weight of objectives achieved or orders carried out. A deep, pure satisfaction. The hunger in my chest had been fed, and it wanted more. My squad approached slowly, weapons lowered but not holstered, eyes locked on me with a mix of respect and something close to horror. They had seen me fight before, had watched me lead charges, hold lines, do all the things a sergeant should do. But this had been different. This had been personal, Cain said quietly, nodding toward the shrine where the screaming had finally stopped. The civilians. I walked to the defiled building and stepped inside. The family from the ground car lay scattered across the floor, bodies arranged in patterns that hurt to look at for too long. The heretics had been quick, but they hadn't been careless. Even the children bore the marks of their attention. Small limbs broken and twisted in ways that would haunt any man's dreams for years, assuming he still dreamed at all. "Burn it," I ordered, my voice harsh, edged with something I didn't want to examine. "Burn it all. Let nothing of their blasphemy remain." Vex pulled a frag grenade from his harness and set a 30-second timer. We fell back to a safe distance and watched as the shrine vanished in a roar of fire and flying debris. The flames took hold fast in the dry wood and cloth the heretics had used to profane the place. Within minutes, the whole structure was a roaring pyre, a column of black smoke clawing at the sky, visible for kilometers. "That'll bring every heretic in the sector down on our heads," Marcus said, checking his chronometer. "We should move, Sergeant. Get back to friendly lines before they organize a response." He was right, of course. Fire was a wonderful way to advertise your position to anyone with eyes. Proper doctrine called for quiet recon, avoid contact if possible, engage only when necessary, gather information, and disappear. But doctrine didn't matter as much as it had that morning. The drums in my skull had rearranged my priorities. "Let them come," I said, slinging my chainsword over my back and checking the charge on my reloaded pistol. "Let them all come." We took up positions around the burning shrine and waited. The smoke climbed higher, a black banner summoning every enemy within range. Somewhere out there, heretic commanders were getting their reports, sending squads to investigate, assuming they were responding to a major Imperial push. They'd expect a company, a regiment, maybe. Instead, they would find 4 guardsmen and a sergeant whose mind was being hollowed out by something that whispered of blood, skulls, and endless war. The first response arrived within 20 minutes. A squad of 12 heretics approached from the north, moving in a loose but competent formation that spoke of decent training and combat experience. They were cautious, but not overly so, expecting, no doubt, to find the site abandoned. I let them close to 50 meters before I gave the order. Our opening volley cut half of them down before they realized they were under fire. Las bolts lanced through the air, strobing the smoke-choked scene in red flashes. The survivors scrambled for cover behind the broken rock markers that had once outlined the shrine's garden, answering with autogun bursts and stolen las fire. "Covering fire," I shouted to my squad, then broke from concealment. What followed barely qualified as tactics. It certainly wasn't the careful marriage of fire and movement they teach at the Schola Progenium, or the structured doctrine that had carried the Guard to victory on 1,000 worlds. It was older, simpler, more honest. It was slaughter. I crossed the distance in seconds, moving faster than I had ever moved in my life. My legs churned like pistons, each stride devouring meters. Strength flooded my limbs, alien and exhilarating. A heretic rose to meet me, his auto gun chattering as he emptied the magazine in my direction. I felt the heat of rounds passing close enough to scorch the air, but none of them touched me. My chainsword took his head off at the shoulders. Blood erupted from the stump, splashing across my armor and helm, so I could taste copper through the respirator. The drumbeat in my skull swelled into a triumphant roar, and I threw my head back and bellowed my defiance at the sky. The sound that tore out of me no longer sounded entirely human. The remaining heretics broke and ran. I chased them across the shattered ground, my blade screaming as it carved through flesh and bone. One made it almost 30 meters before I caught him, the chainsword's teeth chewing through his spine just below the skull. Another dropped his weapon and raised his hands, begging for mercy. The sight of his terror only stoked the hunger eating at my mind. When it was done, I stood alone among the corpses, breathing hard as the drums slowly subsided to something like a steady beat. My armor was red from helm to boots, and steam rose from the overheated teeth of my chainsword. In the distance, I could hear engines. More vehicles, more enemies closing in. "Sergeant?" Vex said behind me, his voice carefully measured. "We should fall back. Set up a new observation post away from the contact site." I turned toward my squad, and they stepped back without thinking. Even through their masks, I could see their faces, their eyes. They were looking at me as if I were a stranger wearing their sergeant's armor. A stranger carrying his weapons and speaking with his voice. Maybe that was closer to the truth than any of us wanted to admit. "No," I said, wiping blood from the chainsword with a strip of torn cloth. "We hold here. Let them come to us." "Sir, that's not tactically sound," Marcus ventured, nervous despite himself. "We're outnumbered at least 10 to 1. If we stay, We'll be overrun. I looked at the trooper who had served under me for 2 years, who had followed me through the hell of Mordia Secundus and the frozen wastes of Valhalla Prime. He was a good soldier, steady, reliable, the kind of man the Guard is built on. He deserved better than to die because his sergeant's mind was being eaten away by whispers of blood and unending war. But the drums were speaking again, and their voice was louder than the small, fading part of me that still remembered duty and honor, and the oath I had sworn to protect my men. "We hold," I repeated, my voice carrying the finality of an executioner's axe. "Anyone who doesn't like it can request a transfer." The next wave came from 2 directions at once. 30 heretics from the east, another 20 from the south, moving with the coordination of troops who had fought together before. They had learned from their comrades' deaths, advancing under suppressing fire and a spreading haze of smoke grenades. It was a textbook assault, executed with the kind of precision that would once have made their instructors proud back when they still served the Emperor. It didn't matter. The drums had climbed to a new terrible intensity, and with them came a strength no mortal soldier should possess. My muscles swelled under my armor. My bones felt denser, heavier. My heart hammered in my chest like a caged beast trying to break free. When I opened my mouth to roar a challenge, the sound made the very air shiver. The battle lasted 3 hours and carpeted the ground in bodies. My squad fought with the ferocity of men who knew they were doomed but refused to bow. Vex emptied his grenade harness in the first half hour, every frag perfectly placed to tear through enemy ranks. Marcus burned through 4 power cells, his laser gun glowing red-hot from sustained fire. Cain, for all his youth, proved himself, dropping heretic after heretic with shots precise enough for a sniper. But it wasn't their efforts that turned the tide. It was something else, something that moved through the enemy ranks like a storm given flesh, wielding a chainsword that sang hymns of slaughter. I lost count of how many I killed. Dozens, certainly, perhaps scores. They came in waves, and I cut them down like wheat before a scythe. My arm never tired. My blade never slowed. With every death, the drums pounded louder. With every spray of blood, the hunger inside me swelled. I could feel something changing within, something fundamental shifting in ways that would have horrified the man I had been that morning. But fear felt distant now, outdated, a relic from another life, another war, another universe. All that mattered was the killing. When the last heretic fell, I found myself standing at the heart of a killing field that stretched for hundreds of meters. Bodies lay piled atop one another, their blood soaking into the soil until the ground itself seemed to weep red. The air was thick with the stench of death, scorched propellant and something else, something like hot metal and burning brass. My squad approached slowly, picking their way through the dead, their faces slack with shock. They had seen something that day, something that would haunt whatever remained of their lives. They had watched their sergeant become something else, something that belonged in the old nightmares of terror rather than on a modern battlefield. "Emperor preserve us," Cain whispered, his young face as pale as parchment. "What happened here, Sergeant? What happened to you?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the voice that came out was not entirely mine. The words rose from somewhere deeper, older, a place of brass and blood and endless screams. "I have been awakened," I said. My voice carried strange harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. "I have heard the true music of war, and it is beautiful." Vex tried to raise his laser gun, fingers straining toward the trigger, but the weapon sagged in his hands as if it weighed a ton. He staggered, confusion twisting his features as he fought to bring the barrel level. The others tried as well, but their movements were slow, clumsy, as though they were wading through thick fluid. I could feel it now, the power flowing through me like molten metal. It was changing me, reshaping me into something meant for purposes far beyond the petty campaigns of mortal armies. The drums were no longer just sound. They were orders, doctrine. Revelation whispered from a realm where gods walked along rivers of blood and sat atop mountains of schools. "You served well," I told my squad. and a small, fading fragment of the man I had been meant it. But your war is ending, mine is just beginning. I left them there among the bodies, walking away across the shattered earth toward distant horizons where greater battles waited. Behind me, I heard them calling my name, their voices growing fainter with every step. They would make it back to command. They would report what they had seen. Their officers would call them mad and ship them to punishment battalions, and their stories would be forgotten. But the drums would go on. It didn't matter anymore. Nothing did. Nothing except the drums pounding in my skull and the hunger gnawing at my chest like a living thing. Somewhere ahead, more enemies waited. More battled. More blood to spill for powers that truly understood the nature of the galaxy. What had begun as a whisper of corruption had become a roaring tide. 3 days passed before I saw another Imperial unit. 3 days wandering the shattered face of Carthax II, following the sound of distant gunfire and the sweet stink of burning flesh. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. I hadn't even stopped to rest. The hunger that drove me was no simple need for food or water or sleep. It was deeper, more essential, a craving that could only be quieted with violence, with death, with the terror in an enemy's eyes. My body changed during those 3 days. The muscles under my armor swelled until the ceramite plates strained to contain them. My hands grew larger, fingers lengthening into something better suited to tearing meat than operating standard-issue gear. When I finally glimpsed my reflection in a puddle of stagnant water, the face that stared back was still mine, but warped. My eyes burned with a light that had nothing to do with human feeling. My teeth had sharpened into jagged points that would have made an orc grin with approval. The drums never stopped. They beat with the rhythm of some vast heart, each thunderous pulse in perfect time with the blood surging through my thickening veins. Sometimes there were other sounds woven through the percussion. Screams, laughter, the ring of steel on steel, the wet rip of blade through flesh. It was beautiful. A symphony of eternal war, played on instruments of bone and sinew. I found the Imperial patrol at dawn on the 4th day. A squad of Mordian Iron Guard moved in formation through a ruined township that had once housed agri-workers. They advanced with the rigid precision their world is known for, uniforms immaculate despite weeks in the field, weapons cared for like holy relics. There were 8 of them, led by a young lieutenant whose mustache was waxed to perfect regulation. They spotted me crossing the rubble-strewn street and brought their lace guns up at once. Professional soldiers, reacting to a potential threat exactly as they were trained to do. The lieutenant stepped forward, weapon raised but not yet aimed squarely at my chest. "Halt!" he called, crisp Mordian accent cutting the morning air. "Identify yourself." I stopped about 20 meters away, looking them over with eyes that no longer saw fellow servants of the Emperor. To me, they were just obstacles. Interference. Meat standing between me and the greater purpose devouring my thoughts. The drums quickened, and I felt my mouth fill with saliva in anticipation. "Sergeant Brune-Hesk, 47th Cadian Shock," I said. My voice carried strange undertones that made several of them flinch without knowing why. "And you're trespassing on my hunting ground." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed as he took in my condition. Even from a distance, he could see something was wrong. My armor was caked in dried blood from half a dozen sources. My weapons were stained red to the hilt. The stink of death and corruption hung around me like a cloak. "You look like you've been through hell, Sergeant," he said, lowering his weapon slightly. "When did you last report to command? We've had rumors of isolated units going missing in this sector." I smiled, and the expression felt wrong. Too wide, too many teeth. "I serve a different command now," I told him, and drew my chainsword. The blade roared to life with a sound like souls screaming. Its teeth spun so fast they blurred into a solid band of metal. The weapon had changed as I had. Larger, heavier, its machine spirit twisted by the same forces remaking my flesh. Runes of brass and bone crawled along its casing, symbols that hurt to look at and whispered promises of endless carnage. The lieutenant opened his mouth to shout an order. I was already moving. The corruption had made me faster than any baseline human had a right to be. I crossed the 20 meters between us in the space between heartbeats, Chainsword carving a perfect arc that took his head cleanly from his shoulders. Blood sprayed skyward in a crimson fan, and his body stumbled 2 more steps before dropping. The Mordians opened fire. Las bolts slashed through the air around me, but they might as well have been rain. Power pulsed through my veins, making me faster, stronger, tougher than any normal soldier. Shots that struck home seared against armor that had thickened and hardened. The plates warped into something more akin to living carapace than forged ceramite. I moved among them like walking death, Chainsword howling its hymn of ruin. One Mordian lunged with bayonet extended, his thrust textbook perfect. I caught his rifle by the barrel and crushed it in my fist, then backhanded him with enough force to shatter his skull. Another screamed as my blade split him from groin to throat, his inside spilling across the cracked concrete. A third broke and ran. I chased him through the ruins, boots barely touching ground as I leapt from collapsed wall to rubble pile. He was young, fit, probably a track champion back on Mordian, but his speed meant nothing. To me, he moved like he was wading through mud. I caught him at the edge of what had once been the town square and lifted him by the throat. "Please," he gasped, face darkening as my grip tightened. "I have a family, children. Please." The words meant nothing, just another bleating animal before the axe. I'd heard the plea before. I would hear it again. Fear never changed, same sound on every world, in every language, in every species that ever learned to scream. It was the one constant in a galaxy full of lies. I crushed his windpipe and let his corpse drop. By the time I returned to the square, the remaining Mordians were dead. They'd tried to form a defense behind an overturned ground car, but it hadn't mattered. My Chainsword had chewed through metal and flesh alike, reducing both to the same glistening ruin. I stood among their bodies and felt the drums in my skull reach a fresh crescendo. Each kill had fed the hunger in me. But like a man drinking salt water, every swallow only made the thirst worse. The corruption was accelerating now, reshaping more than just flesh. It was burning away everything that had made me human and leaving behind only the concentrated essence of violence. That was when I heard the artillery, a distant rumble from the west, heavy guns, massed batteries. Somewhere out there, the war still raged in the hands of ordinary men with ordinary weapons. Soldiers who still believed in duty, honor, and the possibility of victory. They would be massed together in large numbers. Hundreds. Thousands. A feast laid out on the altar of war. I began walking toward the thunder. My warped body moved with purpose across the broken landscape. Behind me, the Mordians' corpses cooled in the early light, their blood soaking into the thirsty soil. They had served their purpose. An appetizer, nothing more. The drums in my head were a constant roar now, drowning out everything except the distant growl of guns. Each step brought me closer to the source of that sound, closer to the massed armies that would provide the banquet I craved. I could almost smell them already, thousands of bodies sweating in their trenches, blood just waiting to be spilled in honor of powers that understood existence in ways mortals never would. I was no longer Sergeant Brune Hesk of the 47th Cadian Shock. That man had died somewhere in the ruins of Carthax II, his soul devoured by hungers too vast for mortal minds. What walked in his armor now was something else, a creature of brass and blood and endless war, shaped by forces as old as the galaxy itself. I was becoming what I had always been meant to be, a weapon, a killer, an avatar of the blood god's will hammered into flesh, bone, and corrupted steel. The artillery grew louder as I neared the front, and other sounds joined it. The snap of lass fire, the screams of the dying, the roar of engines, the shriek of incoming shells. It was beautiful. War's symphony played at full volume. Ahead, armies clashed in battles that would decide the fate of worlds. Commanders pushed markers across maps they never truly understood. But I understood. Corruption had peeled back the illusions and shown me truth. This war, like all wars, was a ritual, a sacrifice to powers that feed on violence and death in the anguish of souls. Every bullet, every bayonet thrust, every drop of blood was an offering on an altar made from the bones of the fallen. And I would be the high priest. The Imperial forward lines appeared as the sun reached its height. Trenches and bunkers carved the land for kilometers, crammed with men who thought they fought for the Emperor, but in truth served a far older, hungrier god. Artillery crews hurled shell after shell into no man's land with steady, mechanical rhythm. Each impact a word in a prayer. I spotted the command bunker in the distance, armored walls bristling with Vox aerials and Auspex arrays. Inside would be the officers and planners, the ones who moved thousands like game pieces, who decided which units lived and which died, who dictated when and where each engagement took place. They believed they controlled the war. They were as much its prisoners as any line trooper. Soon they would understand. Soon they would learn there was only one god worth serving in a galaxy drowning in its own blood. Only one power that truly mattered. The drums in my skull were deafening now, crushing thought beneath their weight. But I didn't need thoughts anymore. Thought was for humans. I had left humanity behind in a burning shrine and a field of corpses that had once called me Sergeant. All I needed was the hunger. All I needed was the kill. I walked toward the trenches, my twisted form casting a shadow that writhed and crawled as if it had its own life. The wind behind me carried the smell of brass and burning blood, omens of what was about to happen. Ahead, thousands of soldiers kept to their duties, unaware that death was walking toward them wearing their own colors. The transformation was nearly complete. There was almost nothing left of Brunhesk now. Only scraps of memory, fragile as smoke. In his place stood a rising champion of the blood god, a creature whose only purpose was to spill blood for the Skull throne. But first, there was work to do. I reached the outer perimeter as the afternoon sun began its descent. Sentries saw me approaching and raised their weapons, but something in my appearance gave them pause. I still wore the uniform of the Imperial Guard. I still carried recognizable gear. The taint was obvious up close, but at a distance I could still pass for human. "Halt!" one of them called, a corporal with a hard, weathered face. "Name and unit." "Sergeant Brunhesk," I answered, voice humming with those unnatural harmonics. 47th Cadian Shock. I have intelligence for the command staff. He hesitated, studying me with the instinct of a soldier who had seen too much. He could tell something was off, but 2 decades of drilled-in hierarchy made it hard to accept that a fellow guardsman could be a threat. "You look like you've been through the grinder, Sergeant," he said at last. "When was your last contact with your unit?" I smiled, and my face split wider than any sane human smile. "This morning," I said. "But they're all dead now." His eyes widened as the realization hit. His finger twitched toward the trigger. Too late. My chainsword took his head before he could make a sound. What followed would be remembered in the records of Carthax II as the Crimson Hour. 60 minutes of pure slaughter in which an entire regiment was reduced to scattered limbs and spreading pools of blood. I moved through their positions like a natural disaster. My corrupted blade chewed through men and fortifications alike. Nothing slowed me. Nothing could. The hunger had burned away every trace of the man I had been, leaving only distilled violence behind. I was no longer a man who killed. I was killing, given shape and purpose. A living weapon forged by forces as old as time itself. When it finally ended, when the last scream faded and the last drop of blood seeped into the earth, I stood alone amidst the wreckage of what had once been the 23rd Mordian Iron Guard. Their banner lay trampled in the mud, its proud Aquila soaked in the gore of those who died defending it. Their deaths had not been meaningless. Every life I had taken was an offering to powers beyond mortal comprehension, a sacrifice that would echo through the warp forever. Their blood fed the eternal war, raging in realms of brass and bone, where champions fight endless battles for the amusement of gods who know that violence is the only truth. I threw back my head and roared my triumph at the blood-red sky. The sound that tore from my throat was no longer human. It was the voice of something ancient and terrible, something that existed only to kill and to spill blood for the Skull Throne. The corruption was complete. Sergeant Brune-Hesk was gone, consumed by hungers too immense for human flesh. What remained had no true name, only whispered titles in the prayers of the blood god's followers. Champion, butcher, living weapon forged in the fires of eternal war. The drums in my skull were a constant storm now, drowning all else. Yet above their thunder I could still hear one more sound, laughter, deep and cruel and endlessly amused. The laughter of a god who had claimed another soul for his legions. I turned toward the horizon where new battles waited and fresh blood begged to be spilled for powers that understood the truth of the galaxy. Behind me, the battlefield cooled beneath alien stars, its carpet of corpses standing as a monument to the futility of mortal ambition. The war would go on without me. Other sergeants would lead other squads into other slaughter fields, most of them dying as pointlessly as the men who had once followed me. But a few, a precious few, would hear the drums, as I had. They would feel the hunger. They would taste the truth hidden beneath the lies of duty and honor and faith. They would learn, as I had learned, that there is only one God worth serving in a galaxy awash with blood. One power that truly understands existence. One eternal truth that transcends race, creed, and species. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. The drums agreed.